and salutations to our fine podcast audience. Welcome to 3 Ps in a Pod, episode 265.
We made it.
We did, and we're back. And as I promised last week, we answered a question last week if you weren't here. We answered a listener question. Today, though, we're going back into our little series, I guess you can call it that, of stuff we didn't say on Sunday.
Yeah, that's
or
right.
things you didn't ask for.
Things you didn't
That's
ask. Things you don't care about, maybe you do.
Exactly.
But like I said last week, Nathan taught us on Sunday, and he said there's some stuff that I didn't get to that I think we can go a little deeper on.
Yeah.
Stuff he left on the cutting room floor
Yeah.
that we're going to pick up and see if we can piece it together into a podcast.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah, I think the hope is, there are often things, I'm sure both of you had this as well, is when you're writing, you start going down little rabbit trails that you feel like, I know this is important and I think it would be helpful to people, but it's not the main point I'm trying to make on Sunday. I probably, to many of you, it feels like we have an unlimited amount of time to get up there and talk, but we really
Or
don't.
too much. They may think not unlimited, but too much.
Too much. And so we really have to trim it back. And so, occasionally I'll come across things where I go, I do think people are wrestling with this, but it's not the ultimate point we're trying to lead this text, or even that we think is important for our congregation as a whole, but might be important for some people. And so there were several things on my head about the law, because I do think for many people, depending on the tradition you come out of Christianity, or if you just spend too much time on the internet, the Old Testament law.
I want to guess most of these folks are.
Well, yeah, that's true.
I think everybody.
I don't know
is.
how you wound up at our podcast if you didn't
That's
spend
true.
too much
This
time
may be the
on it.
only thing they come on the internet for.
I know.
They unplug their internet and then plug it back in to come on every Tuesday to get the new podcast episode.
There is better use of your internet, sir.
Yeah, but I think if you spend too much time, certainly in certain corners of the internet, the Old Testament law becomes very confusing for people. And I know for many people who are even questioning their faith, it presents a lot of issues for people because you read one thing about Jesus, right?
Yep.
And that's the part we kind of hit on. And then there's some stuff in the Old Testament and the laws themselves where if you do this, we're going to kill you.
Yeah.
And you got to. And then there's parts where the people are like, do we have to kill him? And God's like, you better kill him or I'm going to kill you. And you're like, hold on a second. This is it's just totally bizarre to us. And it feels un-Jesus-like. And then people really struggle in their faith over it. And so I thought, I'd like to talk about some of that stuff, but it wasn't really the whole point of the message.
Yes.
Well, talk.
What was it that you
What was
left
so
on the
frustrating that you wanted to say?
So frustrating for me. So I think the big thing and kind of the probably the juiciest part for some people of the message Sunday is certainly in the Old Testament law, there are these laws around slavery and there are these laws around sexual purity, which in our culture, they look very either repressive, or some people might even go as far as say they look morally wrong.
Yeah.
Because it looks like God's saying, hey, you should own slaves and this is how you should handle it. Or if there are specific sexual sins you commit, you got to put that person to death. Yeah. And which seems very difficult for most people because they go, does that sound like something Jesus would say? And so one of the points that I make in regards to those specific commands is the fact that ancient laws don't function the way that our laws, and I'll say particularly in America, function, which is they had legal experts, we have legal experts, but their legal experts did different things than ours do. We live in and I can't think of what the term is called, but basically we live in a written law society, which means someone is writing these things down. They're in a library somewhere. And what lawyers are doing is, and you've seen this if you've seen in courtroom, is they're citing precedents and they are pulling out particular statutes that have been written down that are sometimes multiple pages long with all these different fine print, and you are going, that's the end all be all. Once you write it down, you can't get past it, right? There's no way to get around it because it's written down. But ancient laws functioned more in the way that we would think of as like wisdom. They are wisdom of this is how people in a society should handle things. And sometimes the laws themselves even seem a little contradictory, that things will come out where you'll go, well, in this case, they said you should do this. And in this case, which seems very similar, they did this instead. And there are times like I preached on the first week about not taking the Lord's name in vain. There's a story where in the book of Leviticus, I believe it is, there's a man who is biracial. He has a mother, I believe, who's Israelite, and his father is Egyptian. And he gets in an altercation with another guy, and we don't know what it means, but somehow he curses the name of the Lord. And the people go, well, we know this is serious because if you've read, I've been leading a group through this, there's long times of what do you do when a guy curses the name of the Lord? What they're confused about is this guy's not a full-blooded Israelite. And God never told him what to do if you're not a full-blooded Israelite.
Yeah, because that culture is not bound by our law.
Right. So they go, what do we do? And so they hold the guy, and Moses has to go off and talk to God and go, what are we supposed to do about this? And what comes back is they have to stone the guy, which hard for many of us. This is not the point that I'm making, though, so we don't have time to get on why is stoning the answer, but they decide this guy's got to be put to death. But the part that comes out of it, which is like maybe a new law, part A, the way we'd see it is, even if it's a foreigner who lives among you, even if it's a person who has mixed ancestry, all of them must be treated like the native-born Israelite. And what comes out of that, though it doesn't sound that way, is actually a very compassionate and gracious thing, which says all the blessings of the covenant get applied even if the person's an immigrant. Even if the person is just living among you and you didn't know he was there. Even if he is biracial in this case, which God had told him not to intermarry. But then he just said, if you do intermarry and there's a person among you who's intermarried children, they get to be a part of the covenant too. And the only reason I bring that up is this is an example of those people working out, but you told us not to intermarry, but now we have intermarried and you're going to take the person who because you told us if they intermarry, we got to put them to death. But now you're saying if the guy's intermarried, we can live them. That's the way we look at it, because those seem like two laws that can't exist at the same time. But in the ancient culture, they would say all of these laws are the wisdom of God. And the job of legal experts, and you see this in the day of Jesus, is they're debating them.
Yeah,
They're pulling verses out and they're throwing them in. I think the question then becomes, what do we do about all of that? If that's the way that people in ancient times and people who lived under the covenant at that time, how do those of us who live under a new covenant look at all of this stuff?
Well, don't you think? Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, well, to answer that question you just asked right there, that triggers me to say, well, we do live under the new covenant established by Jesus. And I think what Jesus was trying to do, particularly in his law, which starts with the Sermon on the Mount, but his law is love, which we know. He is the one that helps us see where the law was pointing us. Because I think I said this one in the lead up to this conversation. I said, the ancient Old Testament laws, people saw them as functioning like fences to hem people in, very particular, guidelines.
Here's the boundary. You cross this boundary, you're done.
But I think the way Jesus then starts to say, no, here's what the law meant to do. The law was to point you somewhere, to send you in a direction. And I'm here to show you what that direction looks like.
Yeah, it's the thing that
and that's why he says, I fulfill the law. Jesus fulfilled the law in his own life. Yes. In his teaching, to show us where the law was leading. Is that what you're saying? Yeah,
I do think, that's the way that I think the scriptures would say it, and Jesus would say of himself, is that he says, I've not come to erase any of that.
That's right.
None of that. I've not come to wipe it out. And and he said, I've come to fulfill it. And fulfill it doesn't mean delete it.
No.
What he means is there's wisdom here
Mhm.
that formed Jesus into who Jesus is. And Jesus goes, but I am the fulfillment of that, which means there was something that about that was maybe missing is a bad way to say it, but it wasn't filled to the full.
It wasn't complete.
It wasn't complete yet. And that he points them in a different direction to say, this is what it looks like to actually live this out.
Because if you look at Jesus, he did not, I'm going to say this very carefully, he did not follow the law precisely in certain cases. Here's what I mean by that. They bring him a woman caught in adultery.
Mm-hmm.
The law says to stone her, Jesus.
Mhm.
What do you say?
Mm-hmm.
And Jesus showed mercy. Well, that's not following the letter of the law.
Mhm.
He's pointing towards something else.
And you know, the group that I lead, that when we were reading through this, that's actually the story that someone, I can't remember who in the group, I do remember who, it was a young lady in our group pointed out. She goes, you know, when I read this story, the one I just told about the guy who you're supposed to stone him and they have to go to Moses to figure it out.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they go to Moses, Moses goes to God.
Yeah.
She goes, that reminds me of the story where they're supposed to stone the person. And Jesus says, hey, you know, he doesn't say that law means nothing. Y'all don't even understand that law.
Mhm.
What he says is, okay, he's doing what the ancient legal experts are doing. He's just doing it as the scriptures say, with authority that no one else had, which is he goes, okay, well then how about the person who is without sin be the first one to cast the stone? And he's going, let's get to the heart of what is God actually wanting to see accomplished.
Well, there's so much in that story. I think, it is a good illustration of the things you're talking about. But Jesus already knew when they threw the woman down in front of him and said she was caught in the act of adultery.
Mhm.
Well,
They're also, sorry.
he already knows they are being hypocritical of what they have done, because if I'm caught in the act of adultery, there was a dude there.
Right.
That's right.
And they did not bring that guy as the law
Had commanded.
demanded that they do.
Mhm.
So he's smart enough to know this ain't all on the up and up.
Yeah.
And so there's something else going on. So while that's a good illustration of, what you're talking about, wisdom, the wisdom of Jesus was at that point, let's turn that on them and just say, hey, I know what's happening here, boys.
Mhm.
And all y'all ain't completely clean.
Mhm.
And so I guess if you want to carry this out, being unclean,
Mhm.
I guess you can go on if that's the standard you're going to hold. But let's just make sure that I said, that guy that threw the first stone, he's saying he's perfect. Y'all all think he was perfect?
Mhm.
That's what I think is happening in that.
Mhm.
And what I think is happening with Jesus, and your thing of the fence, Jason, I do think that's the way almost everybody sees laws.
Mhm.
What Jesus does, I think, in saying he redirects us to the difference between a boundary set of laws and a one giant command, which becomes a centered set,
Mhm.
is that all the wisdom of the law and prophets has been pushing us toward this one law of, I love God with all my heart,
Mhm.
mind, soul, and strength,
Mhm.
and I love other people.
Mhm.
All of these things we're supposed to, and you got caught on, I didn't step over this, I didn't step over this, but I don't like nobody.
Mhm.
And I'm not fully devoted to
Mhm.
anybody but me.
Mhm.
And Jesus is constantly pulling his followers toward a centered set, which is him, the fulfillment of the
Mhm.
law.
Because when you live that way, like Ed's talking about, when you live with the love at the center, you don't need fences anymore.
Well, that's
Mhm.
what Paul says. He says, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, goodness,
Mhm.
and self-control. Against which these things there is no law.
That's right.
Mhm.
There is no law.
Yeah.
Law is not necessary. He
Yes.
also says that all these other laws were schoolmasters to get us to this place.
Mhm.
They were tutoring us when we were too
Yes.
young, which, little children need fences.
That's right.
Mhm.
They'll run
right.
out and do things because they're just not wise yet. But once you get grown, you should be at a place where you go, here's the ultimate thing I'm going for.
It's the reason Jesus was able to say, for example, in the Sermon on the Mount, he says, I know you've heard it said, don't commit adultery.
Mhm.
That's the fence. But if you became a person that could not imagine yourself looking at someone with lust in your heart, the fence is irrelevant.
That's exactly right.
Because you
Mhm.
don't even get near adultery because
Mhm.
of the person you have become.
Because at its core, lust is my needs over you.
Yep.
I'm a person that has needs, and you are just the object for
Mhm.
me,
That's right.
including if it's somebody who has agreed to meet my needs.
Mhm.
If all I do with you is to satisfy me,
Mhm.
well, I'm still lusting, even if we had some right to do whatever it is that we did.
Yes.
My need is not the ultimate thing. Love is, I put you above me, you above me. I submit my need to you, trusting that if we're in a loving relationship, you will submit your need to me,
Mhm.
and the whole thing will take place. But that's what it's drawing us toward the whole time. And you're right. I don't think it doesn't keep me from looking at those and gaining wisdom from them, but it doesn't put me in a place of fear that if at some point one of them has to be looked at in a different way, like the woman caught in adultery, and I know what the law says, but I'm not going to legalistically do that because I know these people aren't playing a fair game here, and my job is to love her and to love God with all of my heart. I'm going to point toward that.
Mhm. So I think then what people struggle with then is, okay, so if the whole law is pointing towards love, right? And
Yes.
that's the whole point behind it.
Mhm.
What about all the slavery stuff?
Yeah.
Well, again, that's what I was going to say when we got to the beginning, when you first started. Taking anything and not putting a piece of ancient literature, not putting it in its context, not understanding the historical place of it. For those of us in the Bible, of thinking the Bible is one book altogether. It's a collection of books written over thousands of years, and not saying this is where we are in the timeline of God. Here's Jesus over here, and not understanding that restricting slavery of any kind in the ancient world was a huge movement toward the centered set.
Mm-hmm.
If I have a centered set out here as love for God and love for people, once I restrict slavery in any way, I mean, could God have said, hey, man, slavery's bad, stop it, all y'all wrong? He could have. Sure, he could have said that.
I think that's where people struggle.
Okay.
I
Well-
think they do, but we also, and this now I'm drawing off of Greg Boyd's work, but all along the story of the scriptures, which we've all said, the Bible is a unified story leading to Jesus. All along the story, Jesus is present and he is suffering under the weight of sin all along the way.
Mhm.
So Jesus on the cross is not just an event happening in that very moment
Right.
as an idea. It's happening all throughout the story of the Old Testament.
Mhm.
God is suffering under the weight of his own people's sin for their sake, to move them to his kingdom, to his better
Mhm.
place. And for me, that's what I see happening all along in the Old Testament is the Godhead co-suffering with his people
Mhm.
underneath the weight of this
Mhm.
awful system,
Mhm.
trying to lead them to the place of where he's eventually going.
Mhm.
I think people need to take the idea that God knows where he's going, which is here.
Yes.
This is here. And like you said, suffering with people all along the way, much like a parent suffers with a child who is too young to understand what I need them to understand, what that is behind the rule that I gave them that they push against. But if I tried to explain the rule to them, it wouldn't help them obey it anymore. They don't have the rational kind of mind to say it. And in the culture that world was in, it's very, very hard for us to imagine how violent and brutal
Mhm.
ancient cultures were. And I'm talking not that far back.
Mm, sure.
How incredibly violent and brutal cultures were, and that slavery was as much a part of their world as anything else. And even having any restriction was an act of love. And for God to explain to them all the reasons behind it, yes, he could have. He could have. Would it have ended slavery? No. Would it have made it easier for a person in the 21st century to go, oh, look, God was clean all along?
Mhm.
Well, maybe so. But the truth is, there are going to be things that we don't see in the 21st century
Mhm.
that people are going to look back in the 23rd century and we think we were clean on.
Mhm.
And we also were infantile in our way of understanding.
Mhm. Yeah, I think the benefit of the slavery passages to us is because I believe, 1 Timothy talks about all scripture is God breathed, all scripture is useful to us. I think there's a usefulness to us. And there's a little bit of what I want to do in this series, keep talking about the particulars of our world. They lived in a particular world, in a particular time and place. And God, what we see in the scriptures is not God showing up and snapping his fingers and go, everything I don't like, it's gone. I don't like that. I don't like that. I don't like that. That's what we expect because that's the way we would behave.
Well, it's also what we expect because we think if he snapped his fingers, we'd get to see it. But if God snapped his fingers and got rid of everything he hated, we wouldn't see it because we'd be gone.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah,
we'd be gone.
Yeah. I think, yes, but I think that's the way we think. What we see is we see a God who partners with people. And the way he does it is he gives us, and what the law, because, and I say this in the sermon on Sunday, this is actually technically before I preach the sermon, but so you've hopefully already heard it. They saw the law as a gift of grace. Something has happened since around the time of Martin Luther, where we started looking at some of the stuff Paul says as if Paul absolutely hates the law. I don't think that's an accurate interpretation. The Jewish people saw the law as grace. It is God, because grace is God acting on our behalf, and they saw it as, wow, our God actually tells us what he likes. He actually tells us what works, what would make our life better. And what we see in the slavery passages is God is not only restricting it, if you don't take the thought that what laws are the end of wisdom, of this is the end result, this is what you have to do. If you take it as it's the beginning of wisdom, if you read all those passages like an ancient person, the picture you'd walk away with is God seems to really not like us having slaves. We've all got them, but God really does. I mean, one, he rescued us from slavery. And then he says, if you've got a Hebrew slave, you got to let them go after 6 years. You can have them for 6 years and you got to let them go. And if you kidnap a slave from another person, the person who did the kidnapping, which was basically a slave trader, those people got to be put to death because what you would take from it is, and when they let the slaves go, they'd have to pay them. And you'd go, maybe it's not even worth having slaves at this point. And if you see it as the beginning of wisdom, what you begin to take is the impression he is trying to get them through the work of the Spirit in their life is God's not in favor of you having slaves. And I think it's similar with the sexual purity stuff, which we look at and we go, and once again, I said this to the group I led, I say this on Sunday. I mean, if we're honest about it, there's one verse usually in each set of those that in our culture we find very repressive, which is around same-sex relationships and any same-sex sexual activity being sinful. And we look at that and we go, that's very repressive and it is harmful. But there's about 20 other verses around those, which we all look at and go, why has he even got to tell if you've got a niece or a nephew or a granddaughter, you can't have sex with those people. And if you're having sex with those people, you got to be put to death. What we would call in our world child sex abuse. Yeah. He's writing in it. Well, and all of us go, yeah, something is strained in your sexual relationships if this is what you're getting to. And once again, in an ancient culture where women and children were just living under the threat constantly of any man who wants to do anything he wants to me, no one's going to stop him and no one's going to care. They would hear there's a God who says that if a man decides he can have sex with any woman he wants to have sex with, that man has to be put to death. They would look and go, I want to live in that country. That's a God I want to live under. But we get so caught up with there are these, this is the end result and this is the thing he wants. What Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount is, it's not even about, that was the beginning of it. You've heard it said you're not supposed to do these. What I'm saying is you need to have the kind of view of people where the idea of doing anything sexual with them, if they are not your spouse, that would be abhorrent to your mind. You would go, oh, well, that person's not my spouse, so that's not even a thought that's entering into my mind. Because once again, if you think the law is the end of it, I mean, even Jesus is the end result. Does Jesus literally mean looking at a woman with lust is sinful? But if I can picture her in my mind, or I make up a person, or I AI generate a person who doesn't even exist, and then I look upon that with lust, because that's not a person.
Yeah.
God's cool with that.
Man.
No, because it does damage to me.
That's right.
It
You bring
does
up a good point of where we are in culture, because I imagine those are going to be arguments used in the near future of how people are going to.
Oh,
Is it wrong to have sexual favors
with a
from,
robot?
from a robot
Yeah.
prostitute? Is
Because
that
I'm not
wrong?
harming another person.
well, there's
right?
it currently exists
Yeah.
of AI porn.
Oh, yeah.
Sure,
Yeah.
absolutely. And unfortunately, they're making all types, in order to keep from harming children and other
Right.
people.
Sure.
But is that really, again, bounded set versus center set?
Yeah.
Is the boundary really helping you?
And so what we see
At all.
in these Old
Well, it's
Testament,
the same way as even legally, if you can take a life legally, and
Mhm.
to think that I could do it legally and it doesn't damage me
right?
ignores what most soldiers
Yes.
come home and tell
Oh,
us.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Most soldiers who have had to take lives in the course of battle,
Even justifiable.
injustifiable,
Yeah.
do not walk away from that
No,
as if nothing happened,
you can't.
because we were not meant to do that.
That's right.
And so I think what the Old Testament covenant gives us, because all of that part is much more lengthy. Maybe you don't know this because you don't read the Bible. The Old Testament is much lengthier than the New Testament. And the Old Testament was the scripture that the New Testament used. I mean, the early church
Early
used.
church.
That's
When
right.
they talked about the scriptures, they weren't talking about Matthew, Mark, Luke,
No.
and John. They were
Mhm.
talking about all the law and the prophets. But what they were doing was they were reading it in light of this new thing God has done through Jesus.
Yeah.
We read through that lens, and what it allows us to do is go in the particulars of this world we live in. We don't live in a world where slavery is legally rampant. I know
Mhm.
slavery still exists, but it is not. It is not
not in the United States. There are there are places on this planet it's legal.
sure, but in our culture, this is not a legal thing, right? And certainly the sexual boundaries of our culture look very different than ancient Israelite culture. But what I look at is I go, so this is how God is partnering based on what I know in Jesus to be true. This is the way God does it in the particulars of a culture. I don't copy and paste, okay, I can't own a slave, because none of us, I think, hopefully we're going, if I could own a slave,
Oh my gosh.
how would I go about it? So that I don't copy and paste that because that don't do me no good. I look and go, are there things in my current culture that are legal for me to do?
That aren't loving toward God or
Or
people.
people.
Are there ways that I'm spending my money?
Mhm.
Are there websites I visit that are not just legal culturally? If for many of us the things we're doing, people would go, well, that's just a healthy expression of who you are as a person and your desires. It should be for Christians to look and go, once again, not copy and paste the law. I go, well, now I know how God works in a culture where slavery was the law of the land and was culturally acceptable. Everyone goes, of course, the way that N.T. Wright says it is the ancient world ran on slavery the way our world runs on fossil fuels and electricity. And I believe there will come a time that maybe 150, 200 years from now, it will be so cultural that people go, so everyone just drove gas-powered vehicles?
Mhm.
Everyone just...
And every home had 4 or 5?
Yes.
I mean, every person in the house had their own?
And believers who knew we were supposed to take care of the creation would gather at churches in these gas-powered vehicles, the way we talk about people in the 1700s went to church and they had their slaves with them.
Oh, yeah.
The same way they would look at, as Ed said, at some point in the future, there's going to be something. I don't know what it is, but let's imagine this is the thing.
Yeah.
And they go, why didn't every church start saying, you can't be a Christian if you don't own an electric vehicle? You got to get rid of all. Well, we'd go, well, we live in a particular context.
Well, I'll tell you one right now that was hit me today. I had a conversation today with a person who was a missionary in Panama for 12 years and is now here in the States serving. And we got talking about the political divide. And he said, well, just so you know, in the culture in Panama, the divide is so deep that there's a whole bunch of Christians that think if you vote, you are sinning and you can be under church discipline for voting.
For voting at all.
Because
Wow.
the political system is so corrupt
Mm.
that you're trying to gain power through any way other than King Jesus.
Wow.
Mm.
Wow.
Well, boy, I don't know.
And that's what I'm talking about. That's
Yeah.
a cultural thing
Wow.
where some Christians have looked at the wisdom and go,
Mm.
King Jesus says all authority is given to me.
Ooh.
And when I begin to give any authority to something else, I have violated what Jesus said was his. And I thought, wow, that's a really interesting way to look at
It
that.
is. That's fascinating.
And I believe that's why, and that's maybe making you feel more confused, which is not my hope, which is, okay, so should I own an electric vehicle? I don't even know.
And not vote.
And not vote. Are those, that's not
Maybe.
even the point.
Maybe.
Yes.
I don't know.
That's
Yeah.
not the point I'm trying to make. The point I'm trying to make is, and this is where I get to at the end of the sermon, which is you cannot just you alone with the scriptures look at
That's right.
even the teachings of Jesus
Mhm.
and say, I know what it means to turn the other cheek. Because for 2,000 years, we've all been disagreeing on what actually turned the other cheek
That's
means.
right.
Absolutely.
And so
Mhm.
for you to sit and say, I know what that counts as and what it doesn't, and all those things, it is to say, we need people who are deeply formed by the scriptures, who can be in community with one another and say, I know who Jesus is, but I also know, because I think there are ways in which just telling someone, go do what is loving, may dishonor what Jesus meant, because there are ways in which I go, well, I know what love means, which
Yeah.
love means to let you do whatever feels right for you.
That's right.
And
That's right. It must
love
be.
looks like what Jesus, how Jesus lived, how he died, how he resurrected. But we also need to be aware, Jesus was deeply formed by the whole scripture. He is the point of the whole scripture. And for us to say, we need a community of people who are deeply formed by the scriptures, deeply formed by interaction with the Spirit of God, and who also live in the particulars of the world we live in.
Mhm.
And then we need to be submitted to those people and to the Spirit of God to say, I believe that the Spirit of God's going to work in me. And so that, what do we do about Jesus? The Bible says nothing about how to live in a capitalist society.
No.
To assume that the teachings of the scripture can be copy and pasted to our financial world, to me, is a little naive.
This is,
It-
yeah.
Of course.
This is why we have to stay rooted in the person of Jesus
Yes.
and I'll just say it, the creed of the church that is held true for
Mhm.
2,000 years now, and basically center ourselves there. And all this stuff you're talking about, Nathan, that revolves around that, we wrestle together.
That's right.
We stay in conversation and
We
even,
don't dem-
even conflict. About
That's
it.
right.
You know, I have brothers and sisters I know in the church that fundamentally disagree with me on sexual ethics.
Yeah.
Yep.
They are, because they hold to Jesus and the creed
Yep.
that we have held for 2,000 years. We are a part of the same church.
Yeah, that's right.
You know,
That's
and we
right.
are figuring this out in our time. Who's right and who's wrong? I don't know if that even matters, honestly, in the end, because like you said, we're on a trajectory somewhere anyway,
Mhm.
and that's going to look completely different in 100,
Mhm.
200 years. And that's what matters,
That's right.
you know?
Well, and I think that's one of the bigger things we're going to face as our culture becomes more post-Christian. I think we had a different struggle and we just didn't know it. We know it hindsight now, looking back, to allow the culture sort of for a while sort of agreed with sexual ethics.
Yeah.
Or with the definite.
Outwardly.
I agree. No, I'm not saying that, but I'm saying we didn't see the problem of saying, because it's the cultural waters we swim in, everyone goes, that'll kind of form us into people that'll do what Jesus wants us to do. There was a whole set of problems with that. I think we have another set of problems, which is now we have a whole group of people who aren't even culturally formed based on the ideas around what it means to follow Jesus. And if you're in that place where you go, I don't really even know how Jesus, what would Jesus say is loving to my coworker who does, I had someone say this to me, is my coworker doesn't believe what I believe. What does that mean to love them in the way that Jesus wants me to love them? And I go, well, let's talk about that. Because honestly, it does look different for every person because every person is uniquely different. But there are wisdom from the scriptures that tell us what does it look like to love and serve people in the way of Jesus. And truth is part of that. Grace is part of that. Everything mixes in, but you have to have a community of people and being willing to say, I will allow you to help form me as you're helping me to understand the scriptures and who Jesus is. I just think it's going to be critical for us as people because I don't think our world is any less complex than the ancient world.
Of course not.
It's just a whole different set of stuff.
I don't think it's more complex.
I don't either.
I push against that saying it's more complex.
Mhm.
It's complex in a different way.
Yes.
Yeah, that's right.
Any place there are 8 people in a room, super complex.
Mhm.
Yes, that's right. And so what we have to do is we have to use the wisdom of the scriptures, the person of Jesus that we know, the spirit who lives within us, but also the community of the church, which is being formed by the mixture of all of that, to actually help us live in the particulars of our world in a way that honors God and points to his kingdom. And so I think that's ultimately where we got to get to on this.
And that's a wrap.
There we go.
All right, we're going to wrap it up right there. So next week, we're
If you
going
made it all the way to the end, wow.
Good luck.
Good for you.
I felt
Good
like
for
we got
you.
in the deep water.
I did
Yeah.
too.
I'm going to swim on back. So y'all come back next week. We'll have something else for you. We're going to do this.
I
follow-up?
got another one based on Ed's sermon.
Ooh, we're
So
going to
you
talk
go.
about
Jason's
it.
got things that I should have said. Nathan's got things I should have said.
Ed, here's what you should
Let's just be clear. I got things everyone should say, including myself. We just don't have time for them all.
All right.
I got plenty to say.
We'll do that next week. So come on back. And as always, send us questions if you want us to talk about something other than this. Links in the description. See you next week.